There is a kind of tiredness that lives underneath your tiredness. You slept, you technically rested, but when your eyes opened this morning, something in your chest was already heavy, already bracing, as if the day had made its demands before your feet even touched the floor. You go through the motions, you answer the texts, you show up, you perform the version of yourself that everyone recognizes. And somewhere between your second cup of coffee and the smile you gave a stranger that cost you more energy than it should have, somewhere in that space, a quiet thought passes through you like a ghost. I don't know how much longer I can keep being this version of myself. You don't say it out loud. You barely let yourself finish the thought. Because if you acknowledged it fully, if you really sat with what that sentence means, everything you've carefully built around you might begin to shift. If that is familiar, not as an idea, but as something you've physically felt in your body, then what you're about to hear may change the way you understand yourself. Because that exhaustion, that quiet unraveling you cannot name, it is not a sign that something is wrong with you. According to the work of Dr. Gabor Maté, it may be a sign that something in you is finally ready to come right. For most of your life, you have probably measured yourself by a single question. What is wrong with me? Why can't I just be happy? Why do I push people away? Why do I feel guilty when I rest? Why do I abandon myself the moment someone else has a need? And the world has been eager to give you answers. Lack of discipline, negative thinking, not trying hard enough, not being grateful enough. As if the right self-help book or the right morning routine could fix something that has been living in your nervous system since before you had language to describe it. Dr. Gabor Maté, the renowned physician and author whose work on trauma, addiction, and human development has reshaped how modern psychology understands suffering. His work asked a fundamentally different question. Not, what is wrong with you, but what happened to you? And that single shift from judgment to curiosity, from diagnosis to understanding, changes everything. According to Maté, every human child is born with two non-negotiable needs. The first is attachment, the need to be close to, accepted by, and emotionally safe with the people who care for you. The second is authenticity, the need to know what you feel, to express what is true inside you, to be who you actually are. Here's the problem, and this is where the real story of your life begins. When a child's authenticity threatens their attachment, when being real, being emotional, being needy, being angry, being too much, risks the love or approval of a caregiver, the child makes the choice. It is not a conscious choice. It is a survival choice. The child suppresses authenticity to maintain attachment. They learn to hide parts of themselves. They learn to read the room before they read their own hearts. They develop what Maté calls the adaptive self, a version of themselves designed not for truth, but for safety. And that adapted self, that performance, can run for decades, until it can't, until the exhaustion becomes louder than the fear, until the body starts saying what the mind has refused to, until the cracks in the mask begin to let light through, not because you've failed, but because you are ready. And that readiness, that is what this video is about. Because there are 4 signs, 4 deeply specific shifts that appear when the protective architecture of a lifetime is beginning to dissolve, not into collapse, but into something more honest, something more whole. And the first one is the sign most people misinterpret completely. Sign 1. You start feeling worse, and that is actually the beginning. Let's start with something counterintuitive. You would think that the beginning of a new chapter would feel like relief, like lightness, like waking up one day and suddenly seeing the world in color. But that is not how it works. Not for people who have spent years holding themselves together through sheer force of will. What actually happens is this. You start to feel more, not better, more. Sadness that seems to come from nowhere. Irritability that surprises you. A strange grief you cannot attach to any specific loss. You find yourself crying at a song you've heard 100 times. You feel anger toward people you thought you had forgiven. You lie in bed on a Sunday afternoon and feel a loneliness so vast it almost has a sound. And your first instinct is to panic, to assume you're falling apart, to conclude that something is going wrong. But from a trauma-informed perspective, what is happening is not breakdown, it is thaw. Dr. Gabor Mate's work describes how the nervous system of a child who grows up in an emotionally unsafe environment learns to suppress feeling as a survival strategy. The child cannot afford to feel the full weight of their sadness, their fear, their rage, because no one is there to hold those feelings with them. So the nervous system does something brilliant and devastating. It turns down the volume. It numbs, it dissociates, it creates a kind of emotional anesthesia that allows the child to keep functioning in an environment that is not functioning for them. This is not a flaw. This is extraordinary biological intelligence. Your nervous system decided before you could even speak that feeling less was the price of staying safe. But that suppression does not eliminate the feelings. It stores them in the body, in the tension in your jaw, in the tightness in your chest, in the way your stomach drops every time someone raises their voice, in the chronic fatigue that no doctor can fully explain. So when those feelings begin to surface, when the grief comes, when the anger arrives uninvited, when the sadness sits on your chest like weather, it does not mean you're getting worse. It means your nervous system is beginning to trust that you're finally safe enough to feel what you've been carrying. Think about that. Your body is not betraying you. It is finally trusting you. According to Maté, this thawing, this return of feeling, is one of the most important and misunderstood stages of healing. Most people flee from it. They medicate it, distract from it, judge themselves for it. They assume that because the feelings are painful, something must be going wrong. But pain is not always a symptom of illness. Sometimes pain is a symptom of coming back to life. And if you have been feeling more lately, more sadness, more confusion, more of everything you spent years carefully not feeling, consider the possibility that this is not your unraveling, it is your beginning. But here's what most people miss. Feeling more is only the first sign. The second sign shows up not in your emotions, but in your relationships. And it is the one that makes you feel the most guilty. Sign 2. You begin losing tolerance for relationships that require you to disappear. The pattern. There's a moment, and if you've lived it, you will recognize it instantly. When you're sitting across from someone you've known for years, someone you care about, someone whose presence has been a constant in your life, and you feel, for the first time, a quiet but undeniable truth rise through you. I cannot keep being who I am around this person. Not because they're cruel, not necessarily because they've done something unforgivable, but because every conversation with them requires a subtle deletion of yourself. You edit your opinions, you soften your needs, you laugh at things that are not funny, you say I'm fine when you're drowning, you leave every interaction feeling slightly less real than when you arrived. And now suddenly, strangely, you cannot do it anymore. You start pulling back. You decline invitations you would have automatically accepted. You feel guilty, confused, even a little afraid. You ask yourself, am I becoming selfish? Am I becoming difficult? Am I losing the people who matter? Gabor Mate's work offers a precise explanation for this shift. In his framework, many relationships formed by people who suppressed their authenticity in childhood are not truly mutual connections. They are attachment repetitions. They are relationships built on the same contract the child made with the original caregiver. I will hide who I am so that you will stay. The child learned that love was conditional, that closeness had a cost, that you earned belonging by being useful, agreeable, invisible, or needed. And so they built their adult relationships on that same template, surrounding themselves with people who feel comfortable not because the connection is nourishing, but because the dynamic is familiar. Familiarity and safety are not the same thing. Psychologists have observed this pattern for decades. We are drawn not to what is good for us, but to what our nervous system recognizes. And a nervous system trained on conditional love will recognize conditional love as home, even when it is slowly eroding the self. So when you begin to lose tolerance for these dynamics, when you start to feel the cost of your own disappearance, it is not a sign that you are becoming cold or ungrateful or too demanding. It is a sign that the authentic self, the one that was buried in childhood to maintain attachment, is beginning to reclaim its voice. And that voice is saying something radical, something it was never allowed to say before. I would rather be alone and real than surrounded and invisible. That is not selfishness. That is the sound of a self returning. And yes, it may mean that some relationships change, some may fall away, and that loss is real and it deserves to be grieved. But what is also real is that you cannot build an honest life inside relationships that require your dishonesty to survive. According to Mate, the willingness to risk attachment in service of authenticity, to choose being real over being approved of, is one of the most significant turning points in a person's healing. It is not the end of love. It is the beginning of love that does not cost you yourself. Now, the third sign, and this is where it gets deeper, because this one does not happen in your relations with others. It happens in your relationship with the person you have been pretending to be. Sign 3, the identity you built starts to feel like a costume. The pattern. You have spent years, perhaps your entire adult life, building something, a career, a reputation, a role, the responsible one, the strong one, the one who holds it all together, the achiever, the caretaker, the one everyone calls when they need something because you will never say no. And for a long time it worked, not because it made you happy, but because it made you recognizable. It gave you a place in the world. It answered the terrifying question that every child who had to suppress their true self carries into adulthood. If I am not this, then who am I? But now something is shifting. The title that used to fill you with purpose feels hollow. The achievements that once quieted your inner critic seem to echo in an empty room. You look at the life you built, the one that looks impressive from the outside, and you feel a disorienting gap between what people see and what you know is true. You are standing in the middle of a life that looks like yours but does not feel like yours. And the most frightening part, the part you have not told anyone, is that you do not know what would be left if you stopped performing. This is one of the most profound concepts in Gabor Mate's work, the difference between the adaptive self and the authentic self. The adaptive self is the identity constructed in childhood to maintain safety and connection. It is not fake. That word is too simple, too dismissive. It is strategic. It is the masterpiece of survival engineering. The child who learned that achievement earned attention becomes the adult who cannot rest without accomplishment. The child who learned that caregiving earned love becomes the adult who does not know who they are when no one needs them. The child who learned that silence kept the peace becomes the adult who has 1,000 acquaintances and no one who truly knows them. These identities are not chosen, they are installed. They are the nervous system's answer to an impossible environment. And they work until the cost of maintaining them exceeds the cost of questioning them. So when the costume starts to itch, when the role that defined you begins to feel like a cage, it is not an identity crisis in the way you fear. It is not evidence that you wasted your life or that everything you built was meaningless. It is evidence that you have grown beyond the survival strategy, that you are now strong enough, safe enough, resourced enough to ask the question you were never allowed to ask as a child. Who am I when I am not performing for my safety? That question is terrifying. And it is also sacred. Mate's work suggests that this moment, this dissolution of the adaptive identity, is not the loss of self. It is the precondition for finding one. You cannot discover who you authentically are while you're still wearing the armor that was built to hide it. The emptiness you feel is not a void, it is a clearing. It is the space that opens when a false structure finally falls. The space where something real can for the first time begin to grow. And that brings us to the final sign. This is the deepest one. This is the one most people refuse to see in themselves. Because seeing it requires a kind of honesty that most of us have spent our entire lives avoiding. Sign 4. You begin to grieve a childhood you did not know you lost. It arrives without warning. You're watching a movie and a scene comes on. A parent holding a child after they made a mistake, not punishing, not lecturing, just holding. And something in your chest collapses. Or you are at a park watching a father kneel down to eye level with his daughter, asking her gently what she needs, and you have to look away because the tenderness feels unbearable, not because it is painful to witness, but because something inside you recognizes it as something you never received. And then comes the thought, the one that changes everything. That was supposed to happen for me too, and it didn't. This is not self-pity. This is not blame. This is the arrival of grief, real, bodily, ancient grief for the childhood you deserved but did not get, for the safety that should have been your birthright, for the child inside you who learned to stop asking for what they needed because asking never worked. You may find yourself mourning things you never even realized were missing. Not dramatic absences, not necessarily violence or overt neglect, but the quiet absences, the praise that never came, the curiosity about your inner world that no one ever showed, the permission to be sad that was never granted, the feeling of being delighted in simply for existing that you cannot remember ever experiencing. According to Dr. Gabor Mate, this grief is one of the most important emotional experiences a healing person can have and one of the most avoided. Because to grieve your childhood, you must first see your childhood clearly. And seeing it clearly means releasing the story you've been telling yourself for decades. The story that says, it wasn't that bad, other people had it worse, my parents did their best, I turned out fine. Maté does not ask you to demonize your parents. His work is remarkably compassionate toward caregivers, many of whom were themselves carrying unresolved trauma, doing the best they could with nervous systems that were never given what they needed either. Hurt does not require villains. It only requires unmet needs. But acknowledging that your needs are unmet, truly acknowledging it, in your body, not just your intellect, requires you to let go of the protective narrative that has kept you functional, the narrative that says you were never really hurt, the narrative that says you do not deserve to grieve because your suffering was not severe enough. Psychologists who work within a trauma-informed framework consistently observe that this is one of the hardest thresholds in the healing process. Many people will rearrange their entire lives to avoid crossing it. They will stay busy, they will stay numb, they will stay in the adaptive self forever because the alternative is feeling the full weight of what was lost. But here's what Mate's work reveals about this grief, and it is the most important thing you may hear today. The grief is not the wound. The grief is the healing of the wound. You could not grieve what you lost as a child, because as a child, you did not have the safety, the language, or the support to do so. You had to keep going. You had to keep functioning. You had to turn the pain into performance, into people-pleasing, into perfectionism, into control. Because grief requires a witness, and there was no one there to witness yours. But now, if this grief is arriving, it means something has changed. It means some part of you has finally created enough safety, enough self-awareness, enough inner ground to hold what you could not hold before. The tears are not a sign of weakness, they're a sign of capacity. You're finally strong enough to feel what the child in you could not afford to feel. And that is not collapse, that is courage. That is the beginning of the best chapter in Samov, not because the pain disappears, but because you're no longer running from it. If you recognize yourself in any of what you just heard, if even one of these signs made your breath catch, made your eyes sting, made something deep inside you whisper, Yes, that is me. Then there's something you need to hear, and you need to hear it clearly. You are not broken. You were never broken. You were a child who needed safety and built it from the only materials available. You were a child who needed love and paid for it with pieces of yourself. You learned to shrink so that others could be comfortable. You learned to perform so that you would not be abandoned. You learned to carry everything and ask for nothing. And you called that strength because no one told you it was a wound. And now that the exhaustion has gotten louder than the fear, now that the feelings are breaking through, now that the relationships are shifting and the identity is cracking and the grief is finally arriving, now you are standing at the edge of something you have never experienced before. Not a fixed version of yourself, not a final answer, not the absence of pain, but the presence of truth. The truth of who you are underneath the adaptation. The truth of what you feel when you stop managing everyone else's experience. The truth of what you need when you stop pretending you need nothing. Dr. Gabor Mate has said that healing is not about becoming a new person. It is about recovering the person you were before the world told you it was not safe to be them. That person is still in you. They did not leave. They went underground, into the body, into the silence, into the tension, into the dreams you stopped letting yourself have. They have been waiting, not for rescue, not for permission, but for you to turn toward them and say, I see you, and I am not going to leave you behind anymore. That moment, that turning toward, is not the end of the work. It is the very beginning, but it is the most important beginning you will ever have. Let's be honest about what healing actually looks like. It is not linear. It is not a single breakthrough after which everything falls into place. It is not a before and after story that fits neatly into a social media post. Gabor Mate's work is honest about this. Healing is slow, it is humbling, and it asks more of you than any performance ever did. There will be days when you fall back into the old pattern, when you say yes when you mean no, when you abandon yourself to keep the peace, when the adaptive self takes over because the world feels too loud and the old armor feels too familiar. Those days are not failures, they are part of it. But something will be different because now you will notice. You will feel the cost in real time. You will catch yourself mid performance and feel the gap between who you are being and who you actually are. And that noticing, that small quiet awareness, is everything. It is the crack through which your real life enters. You do not need to heal all at once. You do not need to have it figured out by tomorrow. You do not need to do it perfectly. And if the need to do it perfectly is strong in you right now, recognize that for what it is. One more echo of the child who believed that love had to be earned through flawlessness. You do not have to earn this. The best chapter of your life does not begin when the pain ends. It begins when you stop outsourcing your identity to the pain, when you stop defining yourself by what happened to you and start discovering who you are in the absence of survival mode. It begins quietly, imperfectly, and with more courage than most people will ever understand the moment you choose yourself. Not the version of yourself that was built for approval, not the version that was designed for safety, but the one who has been waiting underneath all of it, patient, persistent, and more real than anything you have ever performed. That version of you is not a destination, it is a practice. And every day you show up for it, even clumsily, even tearfully, even with doubt, is a day you're authoring a story that is finally truly yours. If conversations like this feel valuable to you, if this kind of understanding feels like something worth returning to, consider subscribing so these reflections can continue to find you when you need them. And I want to ask you something genuinely. Which of these four signs felt most familiar to you? Not which one made the most intellectual sense, but which one made you stop and feel something you have been carrying for a long time. Leave that in the comments, not for the algorithm, for yourself. Because sometimes naming what is true is the first act of healing. I will leave you with this. You were never broken. You were just unwitnessed. And the fact that you are here, watching this, feeling this, still searching for understanding after everything you have been through, That is not a sign of weakness. That is the deepest kind of strength there is.